Hello everyone, welcome to Within the Frame. I'm Kim Bo-kyung. China's economy grew by 5.2% last year, hitting the government's official target. However, Beijing faces headwinds this year amid a protracted property crisis, with many experts expecting the country's growth next year to be at around 4%. Though the central bank maintained a market-based benchmark lending rate, it decided later on to cut bank reserves to defend the market and spur growth. How is China's economy doing, and what impact does it have on countries in the Asia-Pacific region? And how are other economies holding up? For more on this, we invite Professor Song Soo-young from Chung-Ang University. Welcome to the show, Professor Song.
Yeah, good evening to you, and thank you for inviting me.
And we also have Professor Hwagyun Kim from Mays Business School at Texas A&M University. Good to see you again, Professor Kim.
Good to see you, and thank you for the invite.
All right, Professor Kim. So China's economy grew by 5.2% last year, like I said before, hitting a government target. However, many say this is lower than expected and forecast the economy to face serious headwinds in 2024. Why is this?
So when we look at economic growth, this can be broken down to consumption, investment, and the government expenditure plus net exports usually. And when we look at the other data release, the merchandise sales part, I think is okay. I think it's around 5.8% increase, so it actually is good. In terms of investment, you can again look at both private sector and the state-owned, the enterprises, the the investment side. The state-owned enterprise, so basically, the countries, the government-based firms, they increased their investment significantly, around like 6%, but the private sector actually lowered the investment by 0.4%. So clearly, given that clearly this kind of things are more led by the government side, this is worrisome, and that's actually where most of these the bad outlook comes from. Also, if you look at the exports and imports, which is the bread and butter of Chinese economy, export only grew by 0.6%, but the imports slightly decreased. So activity-wise, I think getting much slower than they expected, and also continued to slow. And of course, the real estate sector is a problem for China, so it's going to still have very weak demand next year or this year, and also the structural constraint exists with the high debt and then stuff like that. So I think that's probably why.
All right, I see. Well, like our Professor Kim already pointed out, there are many reasons, but Professor Song, one of the main reasons why China is facing difficulties is because its real estate prices have plummeted, and a sustained downturn in this very sector is expected to be a drag on the country's broader recovery for this year. Why is China seeing such a crisis in the property market, and what risk does this pose?
Yeah, particularly the performance of the property market, particularly the real estate, has become some focus of attention in the slowing and the sputtering in Chinese economy. Yeah, that is true, but this is the outcome of some Chinese government policy, and for which has been lasted for the past 20 years, which has been started under the Hu Jintao and Wen Jiabao and almost 20 years ago. So this is particularly the infrastructure investment conducted and initiated by the government and under the auspices of the local government. That what turns out to be has turned out to be a successful. But since 2010, I believe that since the start of the declining population, and which is a natural outcome of the one-child policy, which was started in just more than 40 years ago. So that played out suddenly it played out some crisis. According to Dornbusch, he has mentioned that the crisis will come suddenly without any notice, but suddenly it is realized, and then we can see some kind of a cliff or some falling of the Chinese economy. So this is a very structural issue for the government, but as the Professor Kim has mentioned, earlier that he has explained the overall view of the Chinese economy problem currently they face, as particularly about the demand and some investment in the private sector. That is another source of the problem. So overall, apparently, the real estate problem, which has been pronounced very much, but we look into depths deeply, then the fundamental cause of this crisis is far dated back to the start in the early 20 years ago.
All right, so fundamental problem is China's policy that dates back to 2010, I guess. All right. Professor Kim, so despite this uneven nature of China's economic recovery, Beijing maintained their loan prime rates. Why so? And how did you see the most recent decision to cut bank reserves starting early next month?
Right. The things happened in a sequence. So initially, they make the interest rate maintained both short-term and relatively long-term 5-year. And when they did so, I think probably their projection was they don't want to overly inflate the economy. Given that the real estate crisis and debt crisis are already going on, it's kind of difficult to increase or decrease. So I think that's kind of their decision to stay put to see what happens. But then they realized that the economic forecast is pretty gloomy, and I think it's likely to actually make the economy sink further. So they decided to have a sudden decision to increase or inject the liquidity into the system. So I think the decision to cut back the reserve requirement ratio, that means they're going to inject the liquidity significantly. Actually, it was about 50 basis point or 0.5% decrease, which is a significant one. So it's almost like a semi-quantitative easing. I think it's clearly depending on how fast it can go, but I think it's supposedly from starting on February 5th.
Right.
So clearly they want to really massively inject the liquidity so that the economy starts flowing better. So I think it's partly based on their the negative outlook of the next year or this year's economy.
All right, I see your point. Now, Professor Song, the reason why we're focusing on slowdown in China's growth is actually because it does not end within China's boundaries. And according to Moody's, China's slower economic growth will significantly influence Asia-Pacific economies this year. What is your view on this?
Yeah, I definitely agree with that opinion. As to the prospect of the Chinese economy, currently the Chinese economy has been helped as far as trade is concerned because of the Russia has only exit or only trading partner with China. So Chinese product replace most of the products or import and exports which was conducted under Russia has been replaced by the Chinese product. However, for the Asia-Pacific areas, particularly unless the Chinese consumers' demand is not recovered, then the export to China could be a problem. So to that regard, I think the Korean economy, even though our economy, the top companies such as Hyundai, Kia, or Samsung may have increased their export and earnings and profits in light of the trade between North America or some other advanced countries. But in the European countries, for example, Germany had suffered so much from some sputtering economy in China, particularly even Germany has recorded a negative growth rate in GDP. So to that regard, the engine of the world economic growth should be led by the Chinese economy, unless most of the countries, except United States and some countries, some smaller countries, most of the countries would suffer from some sputtering growth engine of Chinese economy.
All right. Most of the countries would suffer, and South Korea is not an exception. I see. Now, Professor Kim, let's move on to the U.S. economy. As investors become more upbeat about the high possibility of a soft landing for the country, U.S. stocks rallied recently. What other factors did investors see in stocks, and will this continue?
Well, clearly, in terms of like investor sentiment, both macro and micro aspects exist. And for macro the aspect, clearly the Fed policy is the main stuff to affect the discount rate, so of the stock price probably. So we're expecting the interest rate to gradually go down, I think. So for this year, whether it's going to be first quarter or somewhere in between first and second quarter, it's not completely clear, but at least investors are seeing that this is relatively, visible stuff to happen. So clearly that lowers the discount rate, therefore the prices are going up. And also the related GDP and the labor data seem to be much better than expected, or at least the expected to be good. Therefore, I think the cash flow outlook is also decent. In terms of the earnings, I think it's mainly led by some of the big companies, again, still like Apple, Google, and these companies. They're relatively doing well, and Microsoft and also other AI-based firms are doing extremely well. So overall, these big firms are propelling the growth of the corporate earnings, and that led to the high stock prices, I believe.
All right. Well, our Professor Kim told us why investors are so upbeat right now. But Professor Song, some say it is not yet the right time to be fully assured of a so-called Goldilocks environment to come, as there are still some of factors that could cause recession. And what are the scenarios?
Particularly, United States economy has performed quite well, and they have enjoyed the very superior status in the economy right now. And but as Professor Kim has mentioned, even in the United States, the big companies such as Google, Microsoft, they have enjoyed so much high level of markup. So which means there could be some divergence between the U.S., even in the U.S. economy, relatively well-performing and big companies, and relatively a little bit working a little bit worse than among the small and medium enterprises. So that's why it is very important, even for the U.S. economy, to focus on some distribution of the earnings and incomes via the taxation. And for the Korea and some East Asian countries, particularly the South Korea has expected to perform 2.3% in GDP growth in 2024. However, in 2025, it is expected to be lower than. Most of the countries, even though they are slow, but they could expect some improvement in the GDP growth rate, then Korea is expected to go in reverse way, opposite way. Maybe that's because of the base effect prevails in this year's performance in 2024. That's why they have, with South Korean economy, GDP growth rate could be recorded as a very 2.5% or something higher, but it will be stabilized in 2.1%. But as long as this is the scenario to work, as long as the world economy, such as some wars and the battles in Middle East and other countries could be settled down. So still there is a very quite a large uncertainty is ahead of us.
All right, I see. We are going to talk about South Korea's situation, but before that, Professor Kim, I'd like to ask you about Japan stocks. It hit a 34-year high, and some say that Tokyo is even reclaiming its lost decades. What drove Japan's booming stock market, and what's your forecast for the Japanese economy?
It's true that finally the Tokyo's the stock market actually just rallied, and even if it's actually the 34-year high, I mean, for the last 30 years, it's been really stagnant. So I think, I don't know, it's been virtually non-existent in terms of growth. But now I think clearly compared to other countries where inflation led to really high interest rate, Japan still maintained like negative target and negative interest rates, or very, very close to zero, even for the loans and the other corporate rates. So clearly that helped a lot, relatively speaking, compared to other countries. So with the really low interest rate environment and then massive in the liquidity, I think that helped. But despite that, actually, it took a long time. But then I think largely in part of the foreign investors started investing more actively in other countries' stocks for the last 5 years or something. And I think that's one of the reasons, because many of the foreign investors started investing in Japan's stock. I mean, most notably like Warren Buffett, for instance. So I think that's probably one of the reasons. And still, I think the economy-wise, there are some risks ahead because now they probably have to make decisions to increase their the Bank of Japan's prime rate and then target rates, and that can probably increase the cost of debt financing as well as the equity financing, and also it's been like deflationary mode, and finally the Japan starts having some inflated economy, although it's a good thing. The issue is the consumers and also the economic agents in Japan. They are so used to this somewhat low price level, and then when they start seeing this price increases, that actually can lead to some fear actually about like purchasing goods and stuff like that. So that's another possibility, and then possible the downward spiral back again, that some stagflation can occur and things like that. So it's not too worrisome, but I think there's a chance as they increase the target.
All right. Japanese stocks are doing well right now, but there are still remaining concerns over the economy. All right. Well, Professor Song, unlike in the U.S. and Japan, Korean stocks have not seen that much of a rise. Is this because of concerns over China's economy and other uncertainties that you have already mentioned?
Particularly for the South Korea and China, I would like to mention some demographic factors that could work against some growth of the economy. Youth employment in China is very serious, more than 20%. And the youth employment rate is also quite low for the South Korea. So that means that the job market and the prospect of the economy is not as bright as Japan or United States. Particularly in Japan, the youth employment rate or unemployment rate is quite low, because that means they could find their job very relatively easily. And also the supply of labor and with a meaningful some inflation rate, that works quite well for the Japanese economy. That's why they have seen some surge of the stock market. And even Professor Kim has mentioned some Bank of Japan's provide liquidity still further. And even though they have given up some yield curve control, so it's like they start tightening of the monetary policy, which was lenient in the past, but still they would like to keep the interest rate as low as possible, and they would like to inflate the price and give the incentive for the companies to produce, particularly for the domestic economy. So that is quite a contrast between the U.S. and Japan versus the South Korea and China. That what matters is a domestic economy.
All right, I see. Well, Professor Song, we are running out of time, but I'd like to ask you this one last question. Staying on Korean economy, inflationary pressure was actually a great concern for us. And some experts say disruption to shipments using vital trade routes through the Red Sea right now could push up prices and hit economic growth. How concerning is this, in your opinion?
Yeah. Because of the Yemen Houthis rebellions that attacked some freight ships which goes to the Red Sea and the Suez Canal, but that only increased the delivery time and the lagging, and the cost is particularly the freight-wise, the cost is a little bit increased, but it should be temporarily. And then the freight ships such as oil tank or other big ships, even though they take longer, but as long as it is delivered in time and not like such a supply disruption which occurred in the outbreak of the pandemic, that is quite different. So I don't think much of the negative impact on the world economy. What matters is now the Chinese economies, how they could come back to the growth of engine of the world economy. That depends upon some domestic consumption increase, which can be successfully conducted by the Chinese government or Chinese peoples, because they save too much. They save too much. And the social security net is very bad for the Chinese population. That's why they focus on investing in the real estate and also saving too much money. So they must spend and consume more.
All right, I see. So what matters is China's economy, I guess. All right, well, I'd like to ask many more questions to our experts, but unfortunately, this is all the time we have for today's edition. Thank you, Professor Kim and Professor Song, for your time and insights. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, and my pleasure.
All right, that's all for Within the Frame tonight. Thank you for watching, and goodbye.